The lights of Las Vegas were blazing that night, reflecting the frenzy of the city that never sleeps. Inside the most luxurious penthouse at the Bellagio, Ethan Brooks, the billionaire tycoon known for his stunning looks and calculated coldness, was toasting with friends at an extravagant party. Music thumped, champagne bottles popped, and laughter echoed through the room adorned with artwork and luxury furnishings. To Ethan, it was just another ordinary night at the center of his hedonistic universe, where everything seemed to be under his control. "Ethan, do you really think you can win at anything?" Bryce, his longtime friend and eternal provocateur, challenged him as he tossed poker chips onto the table. "It's easy to be the best when you only play games you know you'll win." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued, as he lit a cigar. "I don't play to lose, Bryce. That's the difference between us." His words came out firm, but tinged with boredom, as if responding to the taunt was an unnecessary effort. Bryce smirked mischievously. "All right, Mr. Invincible, let's put that theory to the test. How about a real bet? Something outside your world of luxury and perfection." His words caught everyone's attention at the table. The chatter stopped, and the group leaned in curiously. Bryce knew exactly how to push Ethan's ego. "What do you have in mind?" Ethan asked, crossing his arms with a challenging smile. Bryce turned his phone to show him a photo of Sophie Williams, a famous chef in Las Vegas. In the picture, Sophie was smiling in front of the restaurant she had built herself, Soul and Spice. Her warm smile and lively eyes radiated a rare confidence. But it wasn't her face, Bryce emphasized. "Not exactly the type you'd parade around with, huh?" Bryce laughed. Ethan examined the photo. Sophie wasn't a slender woman sculpted by the beauty standards of the models he usually dated. She had full curves and a casual sense of style, but there was something about her presence that intrigued him. Still, he laughed at Bryce, brushing off any effect of the provocation. "That's it? You think I'll lose because of a woman?" Bryce grinned, knowing Ethan's pride was on the line. "I want to see you win her over, marry her, and stay married for a year. No cheating, no quitting. Think you can do that?" The room erupted in laughter and comments. The dare was too tempting to resist. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, not because of the challenge itself, but because of the unsettling feeling that Sophie seemed different from the kind of woman he'd use in a game. However, the mocking glances from Bryce and the murmurs of the group around him sealed his decision. Ethan extended his hand to seal the bet. "Deal. 1 year. And when I win, I want your Maserati." The table erupted with excitement as Bryce shook his hand. "Done. But good luck, because I think you'll find it's not so easy to manipulate someone like Sophie." Ethan smirked, full of confidence, but deep down he felt something rare: curiosity. Little did he know, that bet was about to change his life forever. The next morning, Ethan woke up to the sound of birds echoing on the balcony of his penthouse, a stark contrast to the lights and constant noise of the city. Dressed in an impeccable suit, he prepared for the first phase of his mission, meeting Sophie Williams. For that, he needed a convincing excuse. After a few calls, his personal assistant, Claire, secured a dinner reservation at Soul and Spice for that very evening. When Ethan arrived, he was struck by the charm of the place. The restaurant wasn't extravagant, but it had a personality missing from the venues he usually frequented. Rustic wooden tables, soft pendant lights, and a wall adorned with fresh herbs created a welcoming atmosphere. Every detail seemed carefully thought out. Sophie was behind the counter, chatting with a customer. Her curly hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her laughter filled the air like music. Even from a distance, Ethan could sense the vibrant energy she exuded. When her eyes met his, she smiled politely before returning to her work. It was a genuine smile, free of any hint of interest or flattery, something Ethan wasn't used to. As he sat down, Ethan ordered the house special, a Caribbean-inspired curry, and was surprised by the complex flavors that burst onto his palate. He knew little about food beyond its price tag, but in that moment, he recognized there was something extraordinary about the dish. When Sophie approached to ask how his meal was, he responded honestly, "Incredible. I've never tasted anything like this before." Sophie chuckled softly, crossing her arms as she looked at him. "Glad to hear that. But let me guess. You're the type who prefers luxury restaurants, where the chef's name matters more than the flavor." Ethan was taken aback by her boldness. He smiled, accepting the challenge. "And if that's true, maybe I'm here to broaden my horizons." It was rare for someone to speak to him so candidly, and it intrigued him even more. Throughout the evening, Ethan tried to learn more about Sophie. He asked about the restaurant, her dreams, and her passion for cooking. Sophie answered in a friendly but cautious manner, like someone used to guarding her privacy. When Ethan mentioned he was a businessman, she raised an eyebrow. "So, you're another one of Las Vegas's sharks. Hope you're not here to buy my restaurant." "Maybe I'm here to be surprised," Ethan replied, carefully avoiding any hint of his real intentions. Despite the light tone of their conversation, he felt Sophie was unlike anyone he'd ever met. That night, as he left the restaurant, Ethan realized his mission wouldn't be as simple as he'd thought. Sophie was smart, confident, and perceptive. He knew he'd need more than his usual charm to win her over. What he hadn't expected was how much he was starting to enjoy the challenge. Back at his penthouse, Ethan grabbed his phone to send Bryce a message. "First move made. This will take longer than I thought, but I have a plan." He turned off the light, and for the first time in years, his thoughts weren't on his next deal or numbers, but on a woman who seemed to live in a completely different world from his. Yet, Ethan hadn't realized that by stepping into Sophie's world, it wouldn't just be her who would change. The rules of this game would start to turn against him, and the self-assured billionaire would soon discover that betting with the heart always comes at a price. Ethan decided he needed a bolder plan to get closer to Sophie. Just dining at the restaurant wouldn't be enough. He wanted to uncover what drove her, how she thought, and, most importantly, gain her trust. For that, he turned to one of his specialties, creating opportunities that seemed spontaneous but were meticulously planned. The next day, Ethan returned to Soul and Spice at lunchtime, this time unannounced. When he walked in, the restaurant was bustling, but he quickly spotted Sophie overseeing the open kitchen. Her team moved in perfect harmony under her leadership. She wasn't just giving orders. She was part of the team, chopping ingredients and plating dishes with the same dedication as her staff. Sophie finally noticed him and raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You again? Don't tell me you're addicted to the curry." Ethan smiled, feigning modesty. "Actually, I might be, and I also thought I'd bring a friend to try it. He's looking for inspiration to open a restaurant, and I said you'd be the perfect person to show him what it takes to make a place successful." Sophie narrowed her eyes, skeptical, but accepted his explanation. "Well, I hope he knows running a restaurant is real work, not just glamour. I can show him what it means to have a passion for what you do." To her surprise, Ethan wasn't bluffing. He brought along one of his business partners, Thomas, a specialist in new ventures. But Ethan's real intention was for Sophie to see him differently. He let Thomas ask technical questions while he watched Sophie light up as she spoke about her journey. "I grew up eating my grandmother's recipes," she explained, smiling as she pointed to the oven where fresh bread was baking. "She taught me that food is more than sustenance. It's how you show care for people. That's why I created Soul and Spice. I want everyone who comes here to feel like they've found a piece of home." As she spoke, Ethan realized there was something powerful in her passion. Unlike him, who always treated business as mere transactions, Sophie seemed to live for what she did. There was a truth in her words that strangely moved him. At the end of the meal, Sophie offered them a tasting of desserts. As they sampled a spiced cake with honey glaze, Thomas commented, "You should open another restaurant. A concept like this would work anywhere." Sophie laughed, but her expression grew slightly firm. "I've had offers like that before, but I don't want to lose control over what I do. My restaurant is an extension of me, and I'd rather it grow on my terms." After lunch, Sophie said goodbye to both of them, but before Ethan could leave, she pulled him aside. "Are you really interested in all this? Or is it just a passing hobby? Because I don't have time for games." Ethan hesitated for a second. He knew this was a chance to be honest, but he chose a middle ground. "I'm interested in people who are passionate about what they do. And honestly, you're unlike anyone I've ever met." Sophie held his gaze, trying to decipher his intentions. Finally, she gave a slight smile. "Well, I'll take that as a compliment. But let me tell you something, Ethan. If you really want to understand what I do, you'll need to get your hands dirty." "Is that a challenge?" he asked, leaning in slightly with a playful smirk. "Call it that," Sophie replied, crossing her arms. "Come by tomorrow morning. I'll show you what real work looks like." Ethan left the restaurant feeling more invested than he'd planned. He knew it was just a small victory, but for some reason, it felt more meaningful than any multimillion-dollar deal he'd ever closed. Back at his penthouse, Ethan sent another message to Bryce. "Phase 2 is underway. But maybe I'm enjoying this too much." He didn't expect it, but the bet was starting to affect him in ways he never imagined. Ethan arrived at Soul and Spice the next morning before sunrise. Waking up early wasn't exactly new to him. Business often demanded long hours, but doing it to engage in something so physical and far outside his comfort zone was a different story. Dressed in simple jeans and a white shirt, a rare look for the always polished billionaire, he entered through the restaurant's back door, where Sophie was already waiting. She wore a flower-streaked apron and had a smile that was equal parts satisfaction and amusement. "Well, look at that." The billionaire decided to get his hands dirty. "Let's see how long you last." She tossed him an apron and pointed to a counter filled with ingredients. "So, where do we start?" Ethan asked, trying to sound confident. "We're starting with the basics. Kneading dough for the bread," Sophie replied, demonstrating the process with firm, skilled movements. Ethan tried to mimic her, but it quickly became clear there was more technique involved than it seemed. The dough stuck to his fingers, and his clumsy attempts drew laughter from the team. "It's fine, you can laugh at him," Sophie told the staff. "He probably hasn't used his hands for anything besides a phone since he was a kid." Ethan laughed along, but internally he felt something unfamiliar. The humbling sensation of being just another person in a group. Not a leader, not a magnate, just someone learning from scratch. Determined not to be outdone, he kept at it. After several attempts, he began to get the hang of it, earning an approving nod from Sophie. As the hours passed, Ethan found himself doing all kinds of tasks. Peeling vegetables, organizing spices, and even learning to serve dishes with the same care and precision Sophie demanded of her team. Though exhausted, he realized there was something deeply rewarding about the work, something he never felt while closing deals or running boardrooms. Mid-morning, Sophie called for a break. They sat together in the kitchen, eating slices of freshly baked bread. "So, what do you think?" she asked, studying him with curiosity. "It's different," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "But I think I understand now why you love it so much. It's more than food. It's about creating something that connects people." Sophie smiled, surprised by the depth of his response. "Exactly. That's why I've never wanted to expand too quickly or sell my brand to investors. I want every dish that leaves here to have a piece of me in it." Ethan sat in silence for a moment, taking in her words. He was used to thinking of business in terms of numbers, goals, and profits, but Sophie was making him question if there was something more. For the first time, he began to wonder if his life, with all its money and power, was truly fulfilling. When the shift ended, Sophie looked at Ethan with a satisfied expression. "Not bad for a beginner. Maybe there's hope for you yet." "Hope?" Ethan asked, laughing. "You know, not everyone's born to understand what it means to create with their hands. But I think you're learning." The sincerity in her tone caught him off guard. Ethan felt a warmth that wasn't just physical but deeply emotional. He realized that the time spent there with Sophie and her team was beginning to shift his perspective on the world. Back at his penthouse, Ethan stood by the window, staring at the lights of Las Vegas as silence filled the space. He thought about the bet, Bryce's Maserati, and, most importantly, the woman who was making him question who he truly was. For the first time, Ethan felt like the bet was turning against him, but in a way he didn't want to undo. The following days were marked by a routine Ethan could never have imagined for himself. He had become a regular presence at Soul and Spice, both behind the scenes and in the dining area. The staff, who had initially been wary of him, started to warm up. After all, it wasn't every day a Las Vegas billionaire washed dishes and helped set tables. Sophie, on the other hand, didn't hide her amusement as she watched him struggle with simple tasks. "You're starting to get better," she said one day, watching Ethan carefully prepare a tray of freshly baked bread. "But don't get too confident. I still have a long list of things for you to learn." "Bring it on," Ethan replied with a grin. He was beginning to realize that the more time he spent with Sophie, the more authentic he felt. The game, which had started as an arrogant bet, now seemed meaningless. Her presence made him want to be a better person. One afternoon, after the day's work was done, Sophie invited him to take a walk through a local market. "If you want to understand what makes my restaurant special, you need to see where it all begins," she said. Ethan followed her through the colorful stalls, watching as she greeted vendors by name and selected ingredients with a critical eye. "You really know everyone here?" Ethan remarked, impressed. "Of course I do. They're part of what I do. A restaurant is only as good as the ingredients it uses. It's a partnership," Sophie explained, holding a bunch of fresh herbs. "And you? Have you ever thought about partnerships that don't involve contracts and money?" The question caught him off guard. He had never considered relationships outside the context of business. "I guess not," he admitted honestly. Sophie smiled. "Maybe it's time you did." As the day wound down, the two stopped to eat at a food truck serving authentic tacos. It was a stark contrast for Ethan, who was used to five-star restaurants. Yet, he found himself enjoying the moment, the simplicity and authenticity of the experience. "You know," Sophie began as she bit into a taco, "you're a mystery, Ethan. One day it seems like you're trying to impress everyone, and the next it feels like you're trying to figure out who you really are. What is it you truly want?" Ethan hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. He knew the answer, but the bet still hung over him like a shadow. I want something real," he finally said, unaware of how vulnerable his voice sounded. Sophie studied him for a long moment before smiling. "Well, real is what you'll find here, but you need to be ready to handle it." That night, as Ethan walked back to his penthouse, he realized just how deeply he was involved. He didn't just like Sophie. He admired her strength, her passion, and her ability to live a life so full of purpose. For the first time, he began to question whether he should confess everything. But something held him back. The fear that Sophie would leave him forever. He felt trapped between the desire to be honest and the fear of losing the only genuine connection he'd ever had. Staring out at the Las Vegas skyline, Ethan picked up his phone and sent another message to Bryce. "This isn't a game for me anymore, but I don't know how to get out of it without destroying her. Or myself." The following weeks brought Ethan a whirlwind of emotions he could barely control. Spending time with Sophie was like discovering a new world, a world where authenticity and passion mattered more than money or status. Yet, the shadow of the bet weighed heavier on him every day. Every time he saw Sophie smile, The guilt crushed his chest. One evening, Sophie surprised him with an unexpected invitation. "I'm going to a charity event at a community center I support. Simple, but it means a lot to me. I'd like you to come." Ethan agreed without hesitation. At the event, he saw Sophie shine once again. Not as a chef or businesswoman, but as a woman deeply involved with her community. She cooked for dozens of children and families, laughed with volunteers, and even taught participants some basic recipes. Ethan stayed silent, watching her with a mix of admiration and growing anxiety. After the event, as they walked back to the restaurant, Sophie decided to open up about something personal. "You know, Ethan, when I started my restaurant, a lot of people said I didn't have the right look, that I wasn't marketable, but I knew that if I stayed authentic, the right people would come." "You're more than authentic, Sophie," Ethan replied, his chest tightening. "You're incredible." She smiled, but there was a caution in her expression. "It's funny hearing that from you. Sometimes, it feels like you're holding back, like you don't want to show who you really are." Ethan looked away, unable to respond. He knew he was on the edge. The truth couldn't stay hidden much longer. But fate intervened before he could act. 2 days later, while Ethan and Sophie were talking at the restaurant after closing, Bryce showed up unexpectedly. He was clearly drunk, a malicious grin plastered on his face. "Hey, Ethan, how's our little project going?" Bryce exclaimed as he walked in uninvited. Sophie, who had been laughing at something Ethan just said, frowned. "Project?" she asked, glancing between Bryce and Ethan. Ethan felt his blood run cold. "Bryce, this isn't a good time," he said, trying to maintain control. But Bryce, oblivious to the tense atmosphere, pressed on. "Oh, come on, Ethan. Admit it, you're killing it. Honestly, I thought you'd quit in the first week. But here you are, practically a culinary master." Sophie stood slowly, crossing her arms. "Ethan, what is he talking about?" The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan desperately searched for something to say, but words failed him. Bryce finally sensed the discomfort in the room, but it was too late. "Sophie," Ethan began, his voice low and shaky, I need to tell you something. When we first met, it wasn't entirely by chance. It was a bet." Sophie's eyes widened, and she stepped back as if she'd been struck. "A bet? I know how it sounds," Ethan said, his desperation evident. "At first, that's exactly what it was. Bryce challenged me to win you over. But it's not like that anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. I fell in love with you, Sophie. This is real." Sophie stared at him in disbelief. "You think that matters? That you can erase the fact that I was just a game to you?" The anger in her voice cut like a knife. "Sophie, please," Ethan pleaded, but she cut him off. "Get out of my restaurant. Now." Ethan hesitated, but the coldness in her gaze made it clear there was no room for argument. He left the restaurant feeling as though he had lost everything. Back at his penthouse, Ethan tried calling, texting, but Sophie didn't respond. He knew the only person who had brought light into his life now saw him as someone irreparably broken. The days that followed were a blur of emptiness for Ethan, a void he'd never felt before. He had everything: money, power, influence, but none of it mattered without Sophie. Every unanswered message, every declined call was a painful reminder of the precious thing he had destroyed. Meanwhile, Sophie tried to move forward, but the pain of betrayal consumed her. She replayed every moment with Ethan, every smile, every conversation, trying to discern what had been real and what had been part of his cruel game. Yet, a small part of her refused to believe it had all been a lie. She couldn't deny the impact Ethan had had on her life, but forgiveness was not something she could offer easily. 2 days later, Sophie received an envelope at the restaurant. It was a letter from Ethan. She hesitated before opening it, but, driven by curiosity, she read, "Sophie, I don't expect you to forgive me, but you need to know the truth. What began as a bet became the most important chapter of my life. You showed me what it means to live with purpose, to build something real. I risked everything and lost because I wasn't honest from the start. I'm leaving Las Vegas. There's nothing here for me without you. But before I go, I created something I hope will honor what you mean to me. There's something waiting for you at the community center. I hope you'll accept it as an apology, not as a bid for redemption, but as a way to thank you for everything you've taught me. With all my heart, Ethan. Confused and hesitant, Sophie went to the community center that afternoon. When she arrived, she found a group of children and teens gathered around a brand new kitchen equipped with ovens, workstations, and top-notch utensils. On the wall was a plaque that read, Soul and Spice Culinary School. A space to grow and create. Sophie stood speechless as a volunteer approached her. Ethan came to us and said he wanted to fund a space where young people could learn to cook and find purpose, just like he found through you. He made sure it was done exactly how you would want it. Tears streamed down Sophie's face. The school was something she had always dreamed of, but never had the resources to create. Ethan's gesture was more than an apology. It was proof that he had listened, learned, and grown. That evening, Sophie found Ethan in his penthouse, his bags packed and ready by the door. He looked worn, like a man who had everything but, for the first time, understood the meaning of loss. "You were really going to leave without saying goodbye?" Sophie asked, crossing her arms. Ethan looked up, startled to see her there. "Sophie, I didn't think you'd want to see me." She took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "What you did at the community center, it was incredible, but it doesn't erase what you did to me." "I know," Ethan said sincerely. "I didn't do it to erase anything. I did it because you showed me what it means to live for something bigger than yourself. I did it because, even if you never forgive me, I want you to know that you changed me." For a moment, silence hung between them. Finally, Sophie spoke. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Ethan, but I want to believe you can be better. That we can be better." Ethan stepped forward, hesitating before he said, "If you give me a chance, I promise I'll never break that trust again." Not for a second. Sophie didn't respond immediately, but eventually, a small smile broke through. "Let's start slow. And for now, you're still going to need dough with me. No easy way out." Ethan laughed, feeling a hope he thought was impossible moments ago. "I wouldn't expect anything less." In the months that followed, Sophie and Ethan began rebuilding their relationship with honesty and care. The culinary school thrived, becoming a beacon of hope for the community. And while the path to full forgiveness was long, they knew they were walking it together. Because, in the end, true love isn't about perfection but about the ability to grow, change, and fight for what truly matters.